The world ended on a Tuesday. Not with the roar of nuclear fire the way Skynet had once unmade the future, not with the slow, bureaucratic collapse of governments and power grids flickering out one time zone at a time, but with a sound far worse than either. A moan, low, wet, directionless, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising out of the Georgia morning like something the red clay earth had been holding in its lungs for 1,000 years and finally, gratefully, exhaled. The dead had inherited the world, and they were hungry. Nobody told the T-800. The temporal displacement event registered as a 0.4-second anomaly in its internal chronometer. A gap between one moment and the next that the machine's logic processors flagged, analyzed, and filed as mission-critical data in less time than a human synapse could fire. One moment, the ruins of 2029 Los Angeles, the war-scorched sky orange with Skynet's fires, the taste of carbon and ozone on sensors calibrated to detect John Connor's biochemical signature at 400 meters. The next moment, silence. Green. The thick, indifferent silence of a Georgia pine forest in what the machine's astronomical positioning system immediately calculated as early spring 2010. The T-800 stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, it processed the following: GPS coordinates, placing it approximately 14 miles northwest of Atlanta, Georgia. Ambient temperature, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity, 78%. No Skynet network signal detected. No hunter-killer air units visible on infrared. No human resistance fighters in immediate vicinity. No John Connor biosignature within sensor range. Temporal displacement confirmed. Mission parameters, undefined. The living tissue covering its hyperalloy frame, a biological masterpiece of Skynet engineering, real skin, real hair, real muscle layered over a chassis that could survive a tank round at close range. Registered the morning air with perfect fidelity. Pine resin, decomposing organic matter, something rotten and sweet underneath the green smell of the forest, like meat left in a warm car. The T-800 turned its head 45 degrees and looked at the source of that smell. There were 3 of them tangled in the tree line 30 meters east. What had once been a woman in a floral house dress, a teenager in a King County High School Letterman jacket, and something so far gone in decomposition that gender and age were no longer determinable. They moved, Serena, not with the purposeful biomechanical efficiency of something alive, but with the lurching, gravity-defying persistence of something that had forgotten it was supposed to stop. Their eyes found the T-800 with the blank, unfocused hunger of organisms operating on pure stem brain function. They made the sound, that low, wet moan. The machine's threat assessment system flagged them, cross-referenced against its entire tactical database, a database containing the military histories of every human conflict from Thermopylae to the machine wars of 2029. Found nothing. No classification, no prior engagement data, no known threat designation. It classified them as unknown biological entities. Assigned them threat level, minimal. They reached the T-800 in 11 seconds. The woman in the floral dress got there first, on her jaw working in that reflexive, purposeless chewing motion, fingers clawing at the living tissue over the machine's forearm with the desperation of something that has known nothing but hunger. For so long, it has become hunger, pure and distilled. Her teeth found the skin of the T-800's wrist and bit down with everything her dead muscles could generate. She accomplished nothing. The T-800 looked down at her for 0.8 seconds. Then it looked at the other 2. Then it looked at the tree line beyond them, where more shapes were moving toward the sound of the moaning, attracted by the commotion the way iron filings are attracted to a magnet. Helplessly, inevitably, without anything resembling thought. There were 9 more, then 14. The infrared sweep expanded and found clusters of them spread across the forest floor in every direction like a slow-moving tide. The machine reached down, took the woman's skull in one hand, and applied precisely 340 pounds per square inch of lateral pressure. The sound was brief. The other 2 lost interest in approximately 4 seconds once the motion stopped. They wandered back toward the tree line, moaning at nothing. The T-800 stood in the Georgia morning and ran a full tactical assessment of its situation. No mission, no network, no extraction protocol available. Temporal displacement of unknown magnitude, indigenous threat, unknown biological entities with no combat capability against its chassis, but present in numbers that suggested total ecological saturation. Human population, unknown, presumed severely reduced based on environmental data. No engine sounds, no radio signals, no aircraft, no electrical grid detectable within 40 kilometers. The infrastructure of human civilization, as its database defined it, appeared to have undergone catastrophic failure. Skynet had wanted humanity extinct. It appeared something had beaten Skynet to it. The machine began walking northwest toward Atlanta at a steady pace of 4 miles per hour. It moved through the dead forest with the silence of something that had never needed to be afraid of anything it had ever encountered, stepping over abandoned cars on the highway on-ramp without breaking stride, passing a Georgia State Patrol cruiser with both doors hanging open and a dark stain across the driver's seat that the machine cataloged and moved past without sentiment. It was somewhere between the overturned school bus and the pickup truck, with the hand-painted words, "Don't dead open inside," across the cargo doors. Instructions that the painter had clearly not thought through. That its infrared sensors picked up the first living human heat signatures in 14 miles. A man, on a horse, moving south down the highway toward Atlanta with the cautious, scanning attention of someone who had learned very recently that the world required a different kind of vigilance than it used to. The T-800 stopped, processed. The man wore a sheriff's uniform, tan and brown. The King County patch is still visible on the shoulder. He carried a Python revolver on his hip and a duffel bag across the saddle that the machine assessed as containing additional firearms based on the weight distribution and the way the man's body compensated for it. Rick Grimes had not yet learned that the dead could run. He had not yet learned about the governor, or Negan, or the true cost of trying to hold on to who you were before the world dissolved. He was operating on the survival instinct and law enforcement training of a man who had been unconscious for the worst weeks in human history and woken up to the wreckage alone. He was, by every metric the T-800's threat assessment system could calculate, almost certainly going to die within 90 days without significant intervention. The machine watched him from the shadow of an overturned 18-wheeler, ran probability assessments. He revised them, ran them again. Then it stepped out of the shadows onto the highway, directly into Rick Grimes' path, and stood there in the pale Georgia morning light. 6'2", 230 pounds of living tissue over hyperalloy combat chassis, and waited to be found. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Rick Grimes had seen a lot of things in the weeks since he'd woken up alone in a hospital that smelled like old death and abandonment. He'd seen his hometown emptied out like a jar someone had tipped over and walked away from. He'd seen a woman with no legs dragging herself across a park lawn with the single-minded persistence of a nightmare that didn't know it was supposed to end when you opened your eyes. He'd seen a little boy, couldn't have been older than 8, standing in a yard in his pajamas at 3 in the morning, facing away, and he'd called out to the boy and the boy had turned around, and Rick had understood in that moment that the rules of the world he'd gone to sleep in were gone and they were not coming back. But he had not seen anything like this. The man, if it was a man, stood in the center of the highway with the stillness of something that didn't need to shift its weight, didn't need to blink against the morning sun, didn't need to do any of the 1,000 small, involuntary things that living bodies do simply because they can't help it. He was large, broad through the shoulders in a way that read less like a human physical characteristic and more like an architectural feature. He wore civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans, boots, and he stood with his hands at his sides and watched Rick approach with eyes that caught the light in a way that made something deep and animal in Rick's chest want to turn the horse around and ride hard in the other direction. Rick didn't turn around. He'd stopped doing what fear told him to do sometime around the 3rd day after the hospital. Fear was going to get him killed faster than anything else out here. He slowed the horse to a stop 20 feet out and put his hand on the python without drawing it. "Hey," he called. His voice came out steady. He was proud of that. "You okay?" The man on the highway said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then, "Define okay." The voice was wrong. Not wrong like sick, not wrong like crazy. Rick had heard both of those plenty in the past weeks. Wrong like a recording of a voice, like something that had learned what a human voice was supposed to sound like by studying recordings of human voices and had replicated the frequency and timbre with almost perfect accuracy. Almost. "You bit?" Rick asked. Standard question now. The most important question in the world now. "Negative." Rick's hand tightened on the python. People didn't say negative. They said no. They said, "God, no. Please, no. Check me. I swear I'm clean." They didn't say negative in the flat, uninfected tone of a man reading from an instrument panel. "Where are you headed?" Rick asked. "Atlanta. Population assessment." "Atlanta's gone," Rick said. And he'd heard it on the last radio signal he'd managed to pull in before the broadcast stopped entirely. The city overrun, the refugee camps overwhelmed, the military cordon broken. "It's been gone for weeks. Nothing in Atlanta but walkers." "Confirmed," the man said. "I have visual data from approximately 40 minutes of infrared sweep. Estimated walker density within the city perimeter, 60 to 80,000 units. Human survivors within city limits, statistically negligible." A pause that lasted exactly as long as a human pause would last. No longer, no shorter. "Where are you going?" Rick studied him, studied the way he stood, the way his chest moved, or didn't move, not quite right, and the breathing shallow and rhythmically incorrect in a way that prickled at something in Rick's subconscious, without quite surfacing into conscious recognition. The way his eyes moved when they tracked the horse, smooth and continuous rather than the jerky saccadic motion of human eyes. The way he hadn't blinked once in the entire conversation. "I'm looking for my family," Rick said. Something processed behind those eyes. "Survival probability increases significantly within a group structure," the man said. "Location of family unit?" "I don't know yet." Rick's jaw tightened. "That's why I'm looking." The horse shifted beneath him, uneasy in a way that horses get around things they can't classify. Not the wide-eyed panic of a predator scent, but the low, persistent unease of something simply wrong. Rick had learned to trust the horse's instincts almost as much as his own. "What's your name?" Rick asked. Another pause. "Reese," the man said, a designation pulled from its database. The name of a human it had studied, a name that would not raise flags. "Rick Grimes." He didn't extend a hand. Neither did the man on the highway. "You military?" "I have extensive tactical and combat experience." "That's not what I asked." The man who called himself Reese looked at Rick for a long moment with those 2 smooth eyes. "No," he said finally, "not military." Rick made a decision. It wasn't a comfortable decision, and it wasn't a fully reasoned decision. It was the kind of decision the New World forced on you. The kind where you had maybe 30 seconds and incomplete information, and the wrong choice meant dying alone on a Georgia highway with nobody to know where you fell. He had a gut feeling about this man that he couldn't name and couldn't resolve, something that sat between threat and asset in a category his experience hadn't yet created a word for. But the man was alive, or appeared to be alive. And in a world where the living were becoming rarer than the dead with every passing hour, you did not walk away from the living. "There's a camp," Rick said, "outside the city. I'm heading there now." He watched the man's face carefully. "You can walk with me if you want, but I need you to understand something first. State the condition. The people in that camp," Rick said slowly, "are under my protection. What you do anything at all, that puts them in danger, and we're going to have a problem. You understand me?" The T-800 processed this, ran the parameters of the statement through its social interaction database, cross-referenced against tactical assessment of Rick Grimes. Former law enforcement, combat trained at civilian level, currently operating under significant psychological stress, but demonstrating above-average situational awareness and decision-making capacity under pressure. Threat level to the machine, negligible. Potential utility value, moderate to high. The camp he referenced represented the first confirmed cluster of living humans within sensor range. Understood, the machine said. They moved down the highway together, a sheriff on a horse and something that wore a man like a suit, while Atlanta smoldered in the distance, and the dead moved through the trees on either side of the road like a slow tide coming in, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. It was Daryl Dixon who saw them first when they came over the ridge toward the quarry camp, and Daryl who put a crossbow bolt in the dirt 6 inches from the T-800's left foot without any warning at all. And Daryl who said, in the flat, mean tone of a man who had grown up learning that strangers were problems wearing faces, "That's far enough." The T-800 stopped, looked at the bolt in the dirt, looked at Daryl Dixon on the ridge above them with the crossbow already reloaded. His eyes narrow and watchful and completely unimpressed by size or stillness or the particular quality of wrongness that had unsettled Rick's horse. "Friend of yours?" Daryl asked Rick. "Met him on the road," Rick said. "He bit?" "Says no." "They all say no." The T-800 looked up at Daryl Dixon and made a calculation. The man on the ridge was lean and weathered in the way of someone who had spent his life outdoors, learning things that couldn't be learned indoors. His threat assessment ranked above average. His eyes had the quality of someone who had been lied to enough times that he'd stopped waiting to catch the lie and started assuming it was already there. The machine said nothing. It waited with the infinite patience of something that did not experience waiting as discomfort, and it let Rick Grimes do what Rick Grimes apparently did, which was talk his way through problems with the steady, reasonable authority of a man who still believed that words could hold the world together even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. Down in the camp below the ridge, Shane Walsh had heard Daryl's warning shot. He was already moving. Shane Walsh moved the way he always moved when something was wrong. Fast, purposeful, with the kind of forward momentum that didn't leave much room for second thoughts. He came up the ridge with his Beretta already in his hand, not aimed, not yet, but held with the casual readiness of a man who had crossed some internal threshold in the early days of the outbreak and had not crossed back. Rick had a line he wouldn't step over. Shane had looked at that line, understood its emotional function, and decided it was a luxury the New World couldn't afford. He took one look at the man standing on the road beside Rick's horse and stopped. Not from fear. Shane Walsh didn't do fear the way other people did fear. He converted it instantly, reflexively into aggression, the way an engine converts fuel into motion. He stopped because something in his threat assessment, cruder than the machines but honed by 38 years of living among people who wanted things from him, fired every alarm it had simultaneously. "Rick," he said, not a greeting, a warning dressed up as a name. "Shane." Rick swung down from the horse. "Man I met on the road. Calls himself Reese. Sorry, he's not bit." "You check him?" I asked. Shane looked at Rick the way he'd been looking at Rick since Rick had walked back into his life at the quarry camp, with an emotion too complicated to name cleanly, equal parts relief and resentment, and something guilty underneath both of them that he kept very carefully buried. Then he looked back at the man on the road, looked at him the way a man looks at something he can't file correctly. Too big, too still, too unbothered by the crossbow bolt still quivering in the dirt near his foot and the 2 weapons currently trained in his general direction. "Take your jacket off," Shane said. The T-800 processed the request. Compliance served its tactical objective of infiltrating the group. It removed the jacket with the mechanical efficiency of something that had learned the physical vocabulary of human movement without entirely absorbing its rhythm. Underneath, a dark Henley shirt, undamaged, no blood, no bites visible on the forearms it extended for inspection. Shane studied the arms, studied the man's face. "Turn around." The machine turned around. Shane looked at the back of the neck, the shoulders, the places people got bitten when they weren't paying attention. Nothing. He looked at Daryl on the ridge, and Daryl gave a minimal shrug that meant, "I don't see anything either, but I don't like it." "Where are you from?" Shane asked. "California," the T-800 said. Its database had flagged California as sufficiently distant to prevent easy verification, while remaining plausible as an origin point for someone of its physical description. "Long way from home." "There is no home," the machine said. "Not anymore." Shane almost smiled at that. It was the truest thing anyone had said in weeks, and it landed with the flat authority of a fact rather than the raw grief most people wrapped around it when they said things like that. He holstered the Beretta. Not because he trusted the man, because the man had passed the visible checks, and because Rick was standing there with that expression on his face. The one that meant he'd already made a decision and was waiting for Shane to catch up to it. "You armed?" Shane asked. "No," the T-800 said. This was technically accurate. It carried no firearms. It did not mention that its hands could punch through a car door, or that it could snap a human spine with the same effort a human expended opening a jar. They brought it down into the camp. The quarry camp was organized the way desperate people organize things. Functionally first, comfort a distant second. Tents arranged in a rough semicircle around a central fire pit. Vehicles parked at the perimeter as a nominal barrier against walkers that everyone knew wouldn't hold if a real herd came through. Dale Horvath's RV sat at the north end like a presiding elder. Dale himself on the roof with binoculars, and the particular expression of a man watching something he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. The T-800 walked through the camp and cataloged everything in the time it took to cross from the ridge path to the fire pit. 12 survivors, in ages ranging from approximately 7. The boy, Carl Grimes, who watched the machine with wide eyes that had already seen too much to be properly childlike, to mid-60s, the woman named Carol, who was stirring something in a pot over the fire and had gone very still when the machine entered the camp, the way prey animals go still when a predator enters their field of vision. 2 functional vehicles beyond the perimeter with keys in accessible locations. Firearms distributed among 5 individuals, concealed or openly carried. Water supply, finite, dependent on the quarry itself. Food, 3 to 5 days at current consumption rates. Survival probability for this group at current resource trajectory, 42 days. Maximum. Glenn Rhee approached first. Glenn. And this said something about Glenn Rhee that the machine noted and filed, that in a group of 12 people, the young Korean man in the baseball cap was the one whose curiosity outweighed his caution. He stopped a careful distance away and looked up at the T-800 with the evaluating squint of someone who had been running supply runs into Atlanta while everyone else stayed safely at the quarry and had therefore developed a practical rather than theoretical relationship with danger. "You're big," Glenn said. "Yes," the T-800 said. "Were you always that big, or is that a recent development?" The machine processed this as an attempt at social levity. Its database indicated the appropriate response was a minimal acknowledgement. "Always," it said. Glenn nodded slowly. "Okay, I'm Glenn. Reese. You know how to use a gun, Reese?" "Yes." "Good. Which we're short on people who know how to use a gun and long on reasons to need one." Glenn looked at Rick. "He's staying?" Rick looked at Shane. Shane's jaw was tight, but he gave nothing readable away, which meant he was thinking rather than reacting, which was the version of Shane that Rick preferred. "For now," Rick said. It was Merle Dixon who made it complicated. Merle had been at the far end of the camp when they came in, sitting on the hood of a truck with a bottle of something amber and an expression of permanent grievance that seemed to predate the apocalypse by several decades. He'd watched the whole arrival with the calculating, mean-spirited attention of a man who sorted every new development in the world into 2 categories: things he could use and things he needed to eliminate before they used him. But he slid off the hood and walked over with the rolling, loose-limbed gait of someone who wanted you to think he was relaxed when he wasn't. He stopped in front of the T-800 and looked up. And Merle Dixon was not a small man, but he had to look up. And the expression on his face cycled through assessment and landed somewhere between contempt and speculation. "Hell of a size on you, boy," Merle said. "Where you from?" "California." "California." Merle said it like it tasted bad. "You don't look like California." He walked a slow half-circle around the T-800 with the territorial deliberateness of a man establishing dominance through proximity, waiting for the flinch that established the hierarchy. The machine did not flinch, did not track Merle's movement with its eyes until Merle had completed the circle and come back around to face it, at which point it looked at him with the flat, neutral attention of something that had classified him and moved on. Merle didn't like that. People who didn't respond to his circling either hadn't understood the social communication it was intended to convey, which made them stupid, which was fine. Or they'd understood it and simply didn't care, which made them something else entirely. He looked at the T-800's eyes and felt, for perhaps the first time since the world ended, something that his pride would never have allowed him to call unease. "You got a problem with me?" Merle asked. "No," the T-800 said. "Good." Merle pointed a finger at the machine's chest. "Because I run things here while the good sheriff was away getting his beauty sleep. You remember that?" Shane, standing 10 feet back, said nothing. His eyes moved from Merle to the man called Reese and back, reading the dynamic with the attentiveness of someone who understood that the real threats in any situation were almost never the ones making the most noise. The T-800 looked at Merle's finger, looked at Merle's face, ran a probability assessment on the social consequence of removing the finger from his chest versus allowing the contact to continue as a calculated concession to group integration. It allowed the contact to continue for 3 seconds, then step back 1 pace, not retreating, simply repositioning, and the finger dropped. Merle grinned, decided he'd won something, walked back to his truck. Shane watched him go, then looked at the machine again with those flat, intelligent eyes. He'd noticed something. Rick could see it in his face, the particular quality of Shane's attention when he was working a problem he hadn't named yet. He'd noticed something about the way the man called Reese had processed Merle's provocation. Not the response itself, which had been reasonable enough, but the pause before it, the calculation visible in the stillness. That night, while the camp slept and the Georgia dark pressed close around the firelight and the distant moan of walkers drifted in from the tree line like weather, Shane Walsh sat awake and watched the man called Reese sitting motionless at the edge of the firelight and thought about that pause. And somewhere in the T-800's tactical memory, a new data point was added to its assessment of Shane Walsh. Threat level revised upward, from moderate to high. Atlanta died the way most things died in the New World. Not all at once, but in stages, each one worse than the last, until the cumulative weight of each small failure became something total and irreversible. The city had been a refugee magnet in the first days, the way cities always were when things fell apart. People flooding in from the suburbs and the rural counties with the instinctive urban gravity of populations that associated density with safety, not understanding until it was too late that density was exactly the wrong thing when the threat was contagion and the contagion was already inside the walls. Now it was a monument to that misunderstanding. 60-story buildings with their windows dark, the streets below choked with abandoned vehicles and the slow, directionless movement of tens of thousands of dead things that had once been accountants and teachers and college students and children, all of them reduced now to the same fundamental function, the same wet hunger, the same terrible patience. Glenn Rhee knew Atlanta the way a surgeon knows an anatomy, intimately, practically, without sentiment. He'd been running supply routes into the city since the second week, threading a battered panel van through the walker-dense streets on memory and nerve, in and out before the dead could mass and cut off the exit routes. He'd mapped the safe corridors in his head, updated them constantly as the walker patterns shifted, or developed the particular expertise of someone who had stayed alive not through strength, but through speed and intelligence, and a thorough understanding of what he was dealing with. He had never dealt with anything like what happened the morning he took the man called Reese into Atlanta. It had been Rick's idea, which surprised Glenn, and Shane had objected to it loudly and at length before Rick had shut him down with the quiet authority that Shane always resented and always eventually submitted to. The logic was straightforward. They needed supplies, the camp was 3 to 5 days from critical shortage, and the man called Reese had indicated, in that flat instrument panel voice of his, that he had conducted an infrared assessment of the city and could identify optimal supply cache locations. Glenn would navigate. Reese would, Rick had paused here, searching for the right word, handle any complications. They took Glenn's panel van. Glenn drove. The T-800 sat in the passenger seat and watched the city approach through the windshield with the systematic attention of a targeting system conducting a sweep. "You've been in there before," the T-800 said. Not a question. 8 times, Glenn said. He was navigating by memory and instinct, taking the surface streets rather than the highway, keeping the van below 20 miles per hour to minimize engine noise. Twice almost didn't come back. Once definitely shouldn't have come back. What changed between the runs that were successful and the runs that nearly failed? Glenn glanced at him. It was the kind of question a tactician asked, not a survivor. Noise mostly, and luck. Mostly luck. Luck is an irrational variable, the T-800 said. Yeah, well, irrational variables are kind of the whole ballgame out here. Glenn turned onto Peachtree and felt his stomach do the thing it always did when Atlanta swallowed the van. A cold, precise tightening. The body's honest assessment of the situation, overriding everything the brain wanted to tell it about confidence and competence. So where are we going? Midtown, there is a National Guard logistics depot on 10th Street. Based on the timeline of the city's fall, the probability that it was fully depleted before evacuation failed is low. Medical supplies, ammunition, and preserved food should be present in significant quantities. Glenn stared at him. Hey, how do you know about a National Guard depot? I assessed the city's infrastructure during my initial reconnaissance. Glenn stopped, started again. You went into Atlanta? Alone? Yes. When? Last night, between 0200 and 0600 hours. Glenn processed this in silence for a moment. Last night, while the camp slept, the man had walked into the most walker-dense environment within 50 miles, alone, in the dark, and come back with precise logistical intelligence, and had not mentioned it to anyone. Did Rick know you were doing that? No. Are you going to tell him? A pause. When relevant. Glenn decided that there were several things about the man called Reese that he was going to need to think about very carefully at some point when his full attention wasn't required for not dying. He filed them away and focused on driving. The depot was where Reese had said it would be. A low, flat-roofed building behind a chain-link fence on 10th Street, the gate padlocked, the exterior surrounded by approximately 40 walkers massed against the fence with the mindless persistence of things that had detected something inside worth wanting and had simply stayed, waiting for the barrier to fail. Glenn pulled the van to a stop half a block away and looked at the fence and looked at the 40 walkers and began running the mathematics of the situation, which were not encouraging. The T-800 was out of the van before Glenn finished the calculation. It moved down the street toward the depot with a gait that Glenn, watching from the driver's seat, could only describe as purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with urgency. No hurry, and no caution. The walk of something that had assessed the variables and found none of them concerning. The walkers at the fence heard it coming, or smelled it, or registered it through whatever degraded sensory apparatus still functioned in their dead skulls, and turned from the fence and moved toward it with the collective, shambling purpose of a wave. What happened next took 4 minutes and 20 seconds by Glenn's watch. He watched every second of it with the focused, unblinking attention of a man watching something that was restructuring his understanding of what was possible. The T-800 did not run, did not dodge, did not deploy any of the frantic, creative survival improvisation that Glenn had developed into an art form over 8 supply runs into hell. It walked into the mass of walkers with the systematic efficiency of an industrial process, each movement calibrated and economical, no wasted motion, no hesitation. It took a walker's head in each hand and brought them together. It drove a forearm through a third skull with the flat, functional force of a piston. It did not react to the hands clawing at its jacket, the teeth finding its forearms and accomplishing nothing. The sheer weight of dead bodies pressing against it from multiple directions simultaneously. 40 walkers, 4 minutes and 20 seconds. When it was done, the T-800 stood in a circle of motionless dead and looked back at the van. Its jacket was torn in 3 places. There was dark biological matter on its hands and forearms. Its face was entirely unchanged. No adrenaline flush, no labored breathing. The trembling aftermath of violence that Glenn recognized as the body's honest receipt for what it had just survived. Nothing. It simply stood there in the Georgia morning light among the dead things it had unmade and waited for Glenn to bring the van forward. Glenn sat behind the wheel for a long moment, His hands were on the steering wheel and they were steady, which surprised him, because his heart was doing something complicated in his chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe, but lived in the territory between them. He drove the van forward. They loaded it in 40 minutes. Medical supplies, ammunition, canned goods, water purification tablets, a hand crank radio that Glenn grabbed on instinct. The T-800 carried loads that should have required 2 men without any visible effort. So stacking crates in the van with the precise spatial efficiency of something that had calculated optimal packing configurations before touching the first box. On the drive back, Glenn was quiet for a long time. The city moved past the windows, indifferent and enormous and dead, and the van's engine was the only human sound in 40 square miles. "What are you?" Glenn asked finally. He asked it the way you ask a question when you already know the answer is going to be something that changes things and you've decided you need to hear it anyway. The T-800 looked at him with those smooth, too steady eyes. Processed the question. Processed the cost-benefit analysis of disclosure versus continued cover. Processed the intelligence Glenn Rhee had demonstrated over the course of the morning. The spatial memory, the tactical improvisation, the quality of attention that had watched the 40 walkers and not flinched. "I am a cybernetic organism," it said, "living tissue over a hyperalloy combat chassis. I was built to hunt and kill humans." The van moved through the dead city. Glenn's hand stayed steady on the wheel. "Were you?" Glenn said carefully. "Built to kill humans?" "Yes." "Are you going to?" The T-800 processed this for 1.3 seconds. "The humans in this world are already being killed," it said, "by something other than me. At current rate of attrition, the species will be functionally extinct within 2 to 3 generations." "That's not an answer," Glenn said. "No," the T-800 agreed. "It is not." They drove the rest of the way back to the quarry camp in silence. In the van heavy with supplies and the weight of what Glenn Rhee now knew and had not yet decided what to do with. Glenn told Rick first. He did it the way Glenn did most things that mattered, quietly without theater, waiting until the camp was occupied with the business of unloading the van and the distraction of real food and medical supplies moving through hands that had been short of both for too long. He pulled Rick aside behind Dale's RV and told him in a low, level voice exactly what the man called Reese had said on the drive back through Atlanta. And he watched Rick's face while he said it with the careful attention of someone who understood that Rick's reaction was going to determine everything that happened next. Rick listened without interrupting. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something that didn't fit any category he'd previously constructed. A slight stillness, the eyes going somewhere internal, the jaw set with the particular tension of a man choosing not to react until he understood what he was reacting to. When Glenn finished, Rick was quiet for a long moment. "He told you voluntarily," Rick said. "Yeah." "You asked him directly and he answered directly." "Yeah." "Something that was built to kill humans," Rick said slowly, tasting the words. "Told the human sitting next to it exactly what it was. Unprompted, in the middle of a city full of walkers with no witnesses." Glenn nodded. "I've been turning that over for the last hour. I can't figure out if that's the most reassuring thing that's happened since the world ended or the most terrifying." "Maybe both," Rick said. He found the T-800 at the edge of the camp's perimeter, standing at the tree line with the stillness it defaulted to when it wasn't actively engaged. Not resting, because it didn't rest, but present in the way a piece of infrastructure is present, functional and patient, and waiting for the next operational requirement. It had cleaned the biological matter from its hands and forearms. The torn jacket was gone, replaced by a shirt from the supplies they'd recovered from the depot, and it stood in the afternoon light looking out at the tree line, where the distant shapes of walkers moved between the pines like dark water finding low ground. Rick walked up beside it and stood there for a moment without speaking, looking at the same tree line. "Glenn told me," Rick said. "I expected he would," the T-800 said. "Is there anything else you want to tell me?" The machine ran a cost-benefit assessment of full disclosure, weighed the tactical value of information control against the calculated utility of Rick Grimes' trust, which its assessment had identified as the load-bearing element of the group's social architecture. Without Rick's trust, the group fractured. Without the group, the survival probability calculations it had been running and revising since arrival dropped back toward the statistical negligible. "I was manufactured by an artificial intelligence called Skynet," it said, "in the year 2029. I was deployed via time displacement equipment to fulfill a termination objective. The displacement malfunctioned. I arrived in this timeline with no active mission target, no network connection, and no extraction protocol." Rick absorbed this. 2029? Yes. So the world I'm standing in right now, you've already seen where it ends up. A version of it. The trajectory of my origin timeline involved nuclear exchange in 1997. The mechanisms of collapse in this world appear to differ. It paused. But the endpoint shares structural similarities: reduced human population, resource scarcity, survival organized around small group dynamics. The fundamental problems are analogous. Rick turned and looked at it directly. Looked at it the way he'd looked at men he was deciding whether to trust. Not for tells, and not for the micro-expressions of deception, but for something harder to name: the quality of presence, whether what was standing in front of him was oriented toward him or toward something he couldn't see. "In your world," Rick said, "the machines tried to wipe us out." "Yes, and you were one of those machines." "Yes, and now you're here," Rick said, "in a world where something else is wiping us out, and you're telling me you have no mission and no instructions and no reason to be doing anything at all." He paused. "So why did you walk into that depot with Glenn this morning?" The T-800 processed this for 1.7 seconds, longer than its typical response latency, which Rick noticed without knowing precisely what it meant. The group's survival probability at current resource levels was 42 days, it said. Weighing the depot run extended that estimate to approximately 4 months. The logical course of action was to improve the probability. "Why does our probability matter to you?" Another pause. The tree line moved with the slow, dark patience of the dead. "In my origin timeline," the machine said, "the war between humans and machines lasted 15 years. In the final accounting, neither side achieved a satisfactory outcome. Skynet's objective, human extinction, was never completed. The Resistance's objective, Skynet's destruction, required losses that functionally negated the victory." It looked at the tree line. "This world has already achieved what Skynet spent 15 years attempting. The question of whether the remaining humans survive is the only strategically relevant question available to me." Rick was quiet for a long time. A crow called somewhere in the pines, and the sound of it was very loud in the stillness. "That's a very cold way to care about whether people live or die," Rick said. "Yes," the T-800 said, "but you do. Care. In whatever way, you're capable of it." The machine said nothing, which Rick, who had learned to read silences the way other people read faces, took as the closest thing to confirmation he was going to get. He made his decision. He'd been making it incrementally since the highway, assembling it piece by piece the way you assemble something load-bearing, checking each component before committing weight to it. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't clean, and it was going to create problems with Shane that Rick was already tired of anticipating. But the new world ran on pragmatism, and the man called Reese, the machine called Reese, had walked into Atlanta and come back with 4 months of survival and asked for nothing in return. "I'm going to tell the group," Rick said, "what you are. They deserve to know." "That will create conflict," the T-800 said. "Everything creates conflict." Rick started back toward camp. "You coming?" The camp meeting happened around the fire pit as the light went amber and long across the quarry water, and Dale came down from the RV roof, and Carol stopped tending the pot, and even Merle drifted over with his bottle and his perpetual expression of aggrieved suspicion. Rick stood and told them in plain language what Glenn had told him and what the machine had confirmed, and he watched their faces move through the stages. Disbelief. Then a strange suspended moment of recalibration, then fear arriving at different speeds in different people. Carol took Carl's hand without looking down. Dale said very quietly, "Good Lord," Merle said. "I knew it. I knew something was wrong with that sumbitch the minute he walked into camp. He pointed at the T-800 with his bottle. "See? I told you. I told every last one of you." "You said he was from California?" Glenn said. "I said something was wrong with him." "Merle." "No." Merle was on his feet, the bottle gone, the Glock that lived on his hip suddenly in his hand, with the practiced speed of a man who had arrived at this moment in his imagination many times and was relieved to finally be here in reality. "No, we are not doing this. We are not sitting around a campfire with a machine that was built to kill people. Are talking about whether we trust it, because we don't. Because you cannot trust something that doesn't have anything inside it that gives a damn whether we live or die." "It walked into Atlanta this morning," Glenn said. "It cleared 40 walkers in 4 minutes so we could get the supplies that are going to keep us alive for the next 4 months." "So what?" Merle's voice cracked on the words. "So what? That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean it won't turn on us the minute it decides we're more useful dead than alive." "Merle," Rick's voice was quiet and entirely final. "Put the gun down." The firelight moved across Merle's face and the Glock in the quarry water behind him, and for a long moment the only sound was the fire and the distant, persistent moan of the tree line and the tight, specific silence of 11 people waiting to find out what Merle Dixon was going to decide. Daryl, sitting on a log to Merle's left, had not moved, had not spoken, had not taken his eyes off his brother's face since the gun came out. He reached over now, slowly, without drama, and put his hand on Merle's forearm. "Put it down," Daryl said. Just that. Merle held for 3 more seconds. Then the gun went down, not holstered, down at his side, finger off the trigger but not far from it. He looked at Rick with the hot, genuine fury of a man who had been overruled in something he believed mattered and was storing the loss in the place where he stored all his losses, adding it to the inventory of grievances that would eventually need settling. The T-800 stood at the edge of the firelight and watched all of this with its flat, cataloging attention and updated its threat assessments accordingly. Merle Dixon, it noted, would not let this go. The T-800 did not sleep. This was, in the accounting of the quarry camp's slow adjustment to what lived among them, one of the harder things to get used to. You could intellectually accept the explanation: cybernetic organism, hyperalloy chassis, biological tissue requiring no rest cycle, and still find yourself unsettled at 3 in the morning when you climbed out of your tent to relieve yourself and found it standing at the camp's eastern perimeter, exactly where it had been standing when you went to sleep 4 hours ago, looking out at the dark tree line with those infrared eyes that saw everything the darkness tried to hide. Dell had stopped sleeping well the night after Rick's campfire announcement. He lay in the RV and listened to the Georgia night and ran the same loop of thought he'd been running for days. The careful, lawyerly internal argument of a man who had spent 64 years believing that civilization was the thing that separated humans from the animals, and who was now trying to locate civilization's center of gravity in a world where the dead walked and a killing machine from the future stood perimeter watch over people it had been built to exterminate. He couldn't locate it, but he noticed and noted carefully that the camp had not lost a single person to a walker breach since the machine arrived. 3 nights. 3 nights of the dead massing at the tree line and being systematically, efficiently, silently dealt with before they could build to the numbers that would require waking the camp. He'd seen it happen on the 2nd night, looked out the RV window at 2 a.m. and watched the T-800 move through the tree-lined shadows with the quiet, methodical purpose of an exterminator, which he supposed was precisely what it was, the irony sitting in his chest like a stone. The camp was alive because of it. He didn't know what to do with that. On the 6th day after the Atlanta run, the T-800 found Rick at the quarry's edge in the early morning, sitting with his boots off and his feet in the water, doing the thing Rick did when the weight of responsibility got too heavy for the inside of his skull. Going very still and looking at something far away and letting the world be quiet for a few minutes before picking the weight back up. The machine sat beside him. On the incongruity of it, the thing that could punch through a car door sitting on a rock with its feet near the water in the Georgia morning did not appear to register in its processing as anything worth noting. The group's cohesion is degrading. the T-800 said. Rick looked at it sideways. Good morning to you too. Merle Dixon has had 4 separate conversations in the past 48 hours with individuals in the group that my audio analysis indicates were arguments for my elimination. Shane Walsh has been supportive of this position in 2 of those conversations. Rick was quiet for a moment. You've been listening to private conversations. I have been conducting ongoing threat assessment. The 2 activities overlap. Shane's not going to do anything, Rick said, with more certainty than he felt. Shane talks. He processes out loud. It doesn't always mean. Shane Walsh is not processing, the T-800 said. He is planning. There is a qualitative difference in the conversational pattern that my analysis distinguishes reliably. Processing involves circular repetition of the same emotional content. Planning involves a systematic elimination of alternatives. It paused. He has been eliminating alternatives for 36 hours. Rick pulled his feet from the water and sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the quarry surface, flat and silver in the early light. He knew Shane, had known Shane since they were both young and stupid, and convinced that knowing the right people and working hard enough would get you to the version of your life you'd drawn up in your head at 22. He knew the shape of Shane's anger, or the particular architecture of it, how it built quietly and then arrived all at once, how it dressed itself in pragmatism and necessity so it didn't have to call itself what it was. What's he planning? Rick asked. Most probable scenario based on current behavioral indicators. A coordinated action involving Merle Dixon and potentially 1 additional group member. Target, removal of the variable they have identified as destabilizing. That's you. Yes. When? Within 48 hours. Merle's emotional volatility creates a natural deadline. Shane will act before Merle acts independently and creates an outcome Shane cannot control. Rick stood up, put his boots back on. He looked at the T-800 with the complicated expression it had come to recognize as his default state. The expression of a man carrying more than a human frame was designed to carry. Doing it anyway because the alternative was letting it fall on someone else. I'll talk to Shane. Talking to Shane Walsh about this particular subject has a low probability of, I'll talk to Shane, Rick said again, firmer. The tone that meant the conversation was decided. The T-800 processed this, logged it, accepted it as Rick Grimes' chosen course of action, and adjusted its contingency planning accordingly. It had developed over 6 days of close observation, a functional model of Rick Grimes that had updated continuously. A model that had become, in the machine's internal accounting, the most important single data point in its survival probability calculations. Not because Rick was the strongest member of the group, or the most tactically capable, or the most ruthless, but because he was the load-bearing element, the thing that held the human architecture together. Remove Rick Grimes and the group's survival probability dropped below 20 days regardless of any other variable, including the T-800's own presence. This was, in the machine's processing, the closest thing to a mission it had. Keep Rick Grimes alive. Keep the group alive. Improve survival probability by whatever means available. It had not been programmed to think this way. The thought had emerged from the data. The thought unsettled it in a way it had no prior framework for processing. Shane found Rick first, which meant Rick's plan to find Shane first and control the framing of the conversation died before it started. Shane came to Rick's tent in the mid-morning with the deliberate calm of a man who had finished his internal argument and arrived at a position he decided was defensible. And he sat across from Rick in the folding camp chair with his forearms on his knees. The same posture Rick had been sitting in at the quarry, which was a thing they'd picked up from each other over 15 years of friendship without either of them ever noticing. And he said what he'd come to say. "It has to go, Rick." Rick said nothing. Let Shane have the space to build his argument, because if he interrupted now, Shane would feel cornered and get loud, and this needed to stay quiet. "I've been watching it for 6 days, Shane said. I've been watching the way it moves through this camp, and I've been watching what it does at night, and I've been watching the way it watches us. And I'm telling you as your friend, as someone who has known you for 15 years, that thing is not on our side. It doesn't have a side. It's running calculations. It helped with the supply run because the supply run improved whatever number it's optimizing for, not because it gives a damn whether Glenn comes home safe. It cleared 40 walkers so Glenn could come home safe, Rick said, because Glenn coming home safe served the number. Shane's voice was level, controlled, the dangerous version of Shane rather than the loud version. Rick, listen to me. It told Glenn what it was, unprompted. You know what that is? That's not honesty. That's a tactical decision. It told Glenn because it calculated that Glenn finding out later would be worse for the number than Glenn knowing now. Everything it does is a calculation. There is nothing in there, he pointed in the direction of the perimeter, that actually cares whether any of us are alive tomorrow. Rick looked at his friend, at the face he'd known since they were both young, and the world made a kind of sense. Shane, it's kept us alive. For now, Shane said. For now it has. But what happens when the calculation changes? What happens when keeping us alive stops serving whatever it's optimizing for? What happens when it decides that the 4 cans of food we ate today are worth more to its survival probability than we are? He leaned forward. We can't afford to wait and find out, Rick. We cannot afford that. The argument was not wrong. Rick knew it wasn't wrong the way you know something uncomfortable is true, with the specific reluctance of a man who has checked the math and doesn't like the answer. Shane's logic was sound. The T-800's behavior had been consistently beneficial, but beneficial behavior emerging from calculation was a different thing than beneficial behavior emerging from something you could actually call loyalty or care, or the baseline human investment in other humans. That was the only thing Rick had ever found reliable enough to build trust on. The machine didn't have that, couldn't have it, could only have the calculation, and yet. You want to kill it, Rick said. I want to be realistic about what we're dealing with. It can't be killed with what we have, Shane. Rick said it quietly. You understand that, right? Daryl put a bolt in the dirt in front of it because that was the right call. Because a bolt in the chest wouldn't have done anything except tell it we were hostile. We put everything we have into it and we don't scratch it. And then it decides the calculation has changed. He paused. So if you're going to make a move, you better make sure it works. Because if it doesn't work, we don't get a second chance. Shane's jaw tightened. He hadn't fully run this part of the calculation. Rick could see him running it now and not liking where it came out. So what do? Shane asked. We do what we've always done, Rick said. We watch, we learn, we stay ready, and we don't make a move until we understand what we're actually dealing with. He met Shane's eyes. Can you give me that? Shane looked at him for a long moment. He looked at him with all 15 years of their friendship and all 6 days of the New World's particular rearrangement of it. With everything Rick's return had complicated and everything the machine's arrival had complicated further, and made the calculation, his own human, imperfect, emotionally loaded calculation, and arrived at the same place he always arrived when Rick asked him for something. Yeah, Shane said, for now. He left. Rick sat in his tent and listened to the camp breathe around him and thought about what the T-800 had said at the quarry. The qualitative difference between processing and planning, the systematic elimination of alternatives. He wondered which one he'd just watched Shane do. The scouts came from the south. There were 4 of them in a rust-gutted pickup truck with a hand-welded steel plate bolted across the grill and a Confederate flag bumper sticker that had been there since before the world ended, and nobody had thought to remove it, which said something about the people inside that the T-800's social database flagged and filed without sentiment. They came up the access road toward the quarry in the mid-afternoon of the 8th day, moving with the particular confidence of men who had decided that the collapse of civilization was less a catastrophe than a renegotiation of terms, specifically a renegotiation in their favor. The T-800 detected them at 1,100 meters. Infrared signatures, 4 distinct heat sources in the vehicle cab, 2 additional signatures in the truck bed. 6 total. When armed, the heat bloom of recently fired weapons detectable on 3 of them. The angular outline of long guns visible in the truck bed. Moving at a speed that indicated familiarity with the road, which meant they'd been here before or had good intelligence about the area, neither of which was a neutral data point. It walked to Rick's tent and said, 6 armed individuals approaching from the south. ETA 4 minutes. Behavioral indicators suggest prior territorial operations. Rick was on his feet before the sentence was finished. The camp organized itself with the ragged, practiced urgency of people who had survived long enough to have protocols without ever formally establishing them. Dale moved to the RV. Carol took Carl behind the vehicles. Glenn positioned himself near the supply cache. Daryl went to high ground with the crossbow, moving through the camp's geography with the silent, instinctive efficiency of a man who had grown up in these woods and understood their architecture in his bones. Shane stood beside Rick at the camp's entrance road with his Beretta out, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem, because this kind of problem was one he knew how to solve. Merle stood to Shane's left with his Glock and an expression of sharp, ugly anticipation. The T-800 positioned itself behind Rick and slightly left, a position its tactical database identified as optimal for simultaneous threat coverage and principal protection. It noted that Rick registered this positioning without comment, which its social modeling logged as a meaningful data point regarding the status of Rick's trust calibration. The truck stopped 30 meters from the camp entrance. The engine ran for a moment, then cut. 4 men got out of the cab with the staged casualness of people performing confidence rather than feeling it. The 2 in the truck bed stayed where they were, hands on their long guns, scanning the camp with the systematic attention of men who had done this before. The man who got out of the passenger side first was broad and soft through the middle, with a neatly trimmed beard and small, bright, deeply interested eyes that moved across the camp's geography and its people with the rapid, acquisitive assessment of someone calculating inventory. He raised both hands in the universal gesture of non-aggression and smiled with the warm, practiced ease of a man who had learned that a good smile was worth 3 armed men in most negotiations. "Aren't easy now," he said. "Just travelers. Saw your smoke." Rick studied him. "You're a long way out to just be travelers." "Worlds change," the man said pleasantly. "Travel means something different now." His eyes moved past Rick and Shane and found the T-800 standing behind them, and something happened in those small, bright eyes. A fractional recalibration, a slight adjustment in the quality of his attention, that the machine's behavioral analysis flagged as significant. Not fear, recognition of an unknown variable, the specific alertness of a man who had walked into a room expecting a certain configuration and found one element that didn't fit the pattern. "You've got quite a group here. Looks like you're managing well." "We're managing fine," Rick said. "Good, good." The man's hands were still up, but his weight had shifted backward. It the subtle postural tell of someone creating distance between themselves and a situation they hadn't fully mapped yet. "I'm from a community, settlement really, about 40 miles southeast, Woodbury." He said the name with a specific emphasis that suggested it was meant to mean something. Governor Blake's been building something real down there. Walls, power, people, real civilization. "You know what I mean?" "I know what you mean," Rick said. "We're always looking for good people, strong people, people who know how to survive and want to do more than just survive." The man's eyes went back to the T-800 again, lingered this time, came back to Rick with a quality of deliberateness that indicated the look had not been casual. "We'd be honored to have your group consider joining us. Real beds, hot food, watch safety in numbers." "We appreciate the offer," Rick said. "No commitment necessary. Come see what we built. Governor Blake personally extends." "We appreciate the offer," Rick said again. The second time had a period at the end of it that the first time hadn't. The man held his smile for a beat longer than was natural. Then he lowered his hands slowly and nodded with the gracious, undefeated manner of someone who had encountered this answer before and had protocols for it. "Of course, can't blame a man for trying." He half turned back toward the truck, then stopped as if struck by a secondary thought. A gesture so practiced it had probably stopped feeling performed to him years ago. "One thing, if you don't mind my asking," Rick waited. "Your friend there," the man nodded toward the T-800. "Big fella. He's not what I'd call a standard issue survivor. We've got some people at Woodbury who might be very interested in making his acquaintance. The smile again, warmer this time, with a specific quality of appetite behind it that the machine's social database identified as the expression of a man who collected things. Governor Blake has a particular appreciation for exceptional individuals. He's not available, Rick said. The smile held. Everything's available in the right conversation. He looked at the T-800 directly for the first time. Looked at it with those small, bright inventory eyes, running his calculation openly, not bothering to hide it. "What's your name, friend?" "Reese," the T-800 said. "Reese." The man tasted the name. "You ever want a real home, Reese? You come find us. Woodbury takes care of its own." He turned back to the truck. His men got in. The engine started. The truck reversed down the access road with the unhurried confidence of people who had gotten what they came for, even though they were leaving without it. And the sound of it faded south into the Georgia afternoon. The camp exhaled. "Well," Merle said into the silence, "that was a bunch of bad news wearing friendly faces." For once, nobody argued with him. That night, Rick called a tight council around the fire. Himself, Shane, Daryl, Glenn, and Dale. The group's de facto decision-making architecture gathered in the firelight while the rest of the camp slept. The T-800 stood at the perimeter and listened to every word at 400 meters through audio sensors calibrated for exactly this range. "Woodbury," Dale said. "I've heard the name." And before the broadcast stopped, there were people talking about it on the CB, a settlement, fortified, taking in survivors. But some of the things people said about it, he shook his head. There were stories. "What kind of stories?" Glenn asked. "The kind you hope are exaggerations." Dale looked at his hands. "Mandatory service, people who tried to leave and didn't make it, and something about entertainment, some kind of arena." Shane said, "They wanted the machine." "That's what they came for," Rick said. "Maybe not exclusively, but that's what they looked at." "Governor Blake," Daryl turned the name over. "I've heard that name too, from people passing through before the camp set up here. Nobody who mentioned him was laughing when they said it." "So we have a fortified settlement 40 miles south," Glenn said. "Run by someone nobody laughs about, who now knows where we are and has seen our supplies and specifically noticed our..." He glanced toward the perimeter where the T-800 stood motionless in the dark. "Our situation." "They'll come back," Shane said. Not a question. "They'll come back," Rick confirmed. The fire moved and the quarry water was perfectly dark and still, and somewhere in the tree line, a walker moved against branches with the slow, directionless patience of the permanently hungry. "We need to move the camp," Rick said. The argument that followed lasted 40 minutes and covered the familiar geography of their disagreements, Shane wanting to fortify and confront, Daryl advocating for mobility and distance, Dale raising the question of Carol and the women, and Carl and the impracticality of running indefinitely. Glenn running supply logistics in his head with the quiet competence of someone who thought in operational terms. Rick listened to all of it and said very little, which was the version of Rick that actually worried Shane, because the quiet Rick was the Rick who had already made a decision and was letting the argument run its course out of respect rather than genuine uncertainty. At the perimeter, the T-800 processed what it had heard and added Woodbury to its tactical threat matrix. Philip Blake, the governor, a man who collected exceptional individuals who had built walls and power 40 miles south, who had looked at the T-800 with inventory eyes and sent scouts in a fortified truck and smiled with the warm, practiced ease of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by acquiring the right asset. The machine ran probability assessments on Woodbury's next action, cross-referenced against the behavioral data from the afternoon's encounter, against the stories Dale had referenced, against the particular quality of the scout leader's smile when he'd looked at the T-800 and said everything's available in the right conversation. The assessment resolved at 94.7% probability of return within 72 hours, with more men, with a specific objective. It expanded the perimeter sweep to 2 kilometers and increased audio monitoring frequency, and in the Georgia night, the dead moved through the trees in their slow, eternal tide. And somewhere 40 miles south, a man named Philip Blake sat in a room with walls and power and told the men around him what he'd found at the quarry camp. and his small bright eyes would have been very alive when he described the large man called Reese, who stood too still and moved too efficiently, and had looked back at him with eyes that didn't carry the particular human anxiety that every other set of eyes in that camp had carried. Eyes like an answer to a question Philip Blake had been asking for a long time. The T-800 noted in its internal accounting that the situation had moved from moderately complex to operationally critical. It began preparing accordingly. Merle Dixon made his move at 4 a.m. on the 9th day. He'd been building toward it since the campfire announcement, storing the decision in the same place he stored everything that mattered to him. Not in his head where things got complicated and talked around and eventually rationalized into inaction, but in his gut, where things were simple and binary and eventually became inevitable. The machine was wrong. The machine was dangerous. Rick was going to get them all killed protecting it because Rick had a particular kind of blindness about things he decided to believe in, and Shane had agreed with Merle and then backed down because Shane always backed down when Rick put the quiet voice on him. And Daryl wasn't going to do anything because Daryl never did anything that might put distance between himself and his brother's approval, even when his brother was clearly right. So Merle was going to handle it himself. He'd thought it through as carefully as Merle Dixon thought anything through, which meant he'd identified the desired outcome and worked backward to the most direct available path without spending too much time on the variables that complicated the route. The machine couldn't be killed with a handgun. Rick had established that much, and Merle had tested the math himself during a sleepless night of increasingly circular logic and arrived at the same conclusion. But it could be disabled, temporarily, long enough. The quarry was deep, cold, 30 feet at its center, the bottom dark and silted and unreachable without equipment they didn't have, chain from the supply cache, cinder blocks from the abandoned construction materials at the quarry's north edge, 4 of them stacked and bound. The machine went into the water, waited, and it stayed in the water. And even if it couldn't drown, it also couldn't walk out of 30 feet of Georgia quarry water, dragging 4 cinder blocks, not in any time frame that mattered. And by the time it worked free, if it worked free, they'd be gone, and it would be someone else's problem. It was not a sophisticated plan. Merle had never confused sophistication with effectiveness. He got to the supply cache at 3:47 a.m. and had the chain in his hands at 3:49. He'd recruited Tommy Zbornak, a heavy-set man from Marietta who'd attached himself to the camp in the second week and who had the specific quality of moral vacancy that made him useful in situations that required someone to do something without asking questions about it. And Tommy was already at the cinder blocks, moving them with the effortful silence of a large man trying to be quiet. And the T-800 was watching them from the moment they left their tents. It had logged Merle's behavioral indicators reaching critical threshold at approximately 11 p.m. the previous night. The quality of stillness that preceded action in humans who had finished deliberating and begun executing. It had tracked him through the camp's darkness with infrared precision, observed the supply cache approach, identified the chain in the cinder blocks and the quarry's geometry, and constructed the complete operational picture in approximately 4 seconds. It walked out of the shadows at the quarry's edge and stood between Merle and the water. Merle stopped. Tommy stopped. The chain made a sound against the gravel that seemed very loud in the 4 a.m. silence. "Put the chain down, Merle," the T-800 said. Merle's Glock was in his hand before the sentence finished. Not aimed, not yet, held at his side with the coiled readiness of a man who had made a calculation about its usefulness and decided that even a futile gesture sometimes needed to be made. "You knew," Merle said. The anger in his voice had the specific quality of a man who had expected to be clever and discovered he had been transparent. "You were listening. This whole time you were—" "Yes," the T-800 said. "So you know what I think of you?" "Yes. And you know I'm not wrong." Merle took a step forward. Tommy didn't move, standing at the cinder blocks with the frozen attention of a man who had signed on for something he'd understood in the abstract and was now understanding in the specific. "You know I'm not wrong about what you are. You told Glenn yourself. I'm built to kill people. That's what you said. Built to kill people. And Rick's got you living in our camp with our food and our kids." Carl Grimes, the T-800 said, 9 years old, 41 pounds below healthy body weight for his age, currently running a low-grade infection in his left foot from a cut sustained 6 days ago that has not been properly treated. If the infection progresses untreated, for another 72 hours, it will become systemic. A pause. The medical supplies recovered from the Atlanta depot included the antibiotics required to treat it. And I identified the infection 4 days ago and provided the relevant supplies to Carol Pelletier with instructions for treatment without informing the group in order to avoid creating a dynamic in which the group's appreciation of my utility was leveraged against their judgment of my nature. Merle stared at him. The Glock stayed at his side. I did not tell Rick Grimes, the T-800 continued. I did not tell anyone. I provided the supplies and the information to the person most likely to act on it quietly and effectively. The objective was the child's health, not the group's gratitude. In the quarry dark, something moved across Merle Dixon's face that he would have died before calling what it was. It moved through him like weather and left him standing at the quarry's edge with the chain on the ground and the Glock at his side, and an expression that had lost its certainty without finding anything to replace it. That doesn't change what you are, Merle said. His voice was quieter. No, the T-800 agreed. It doesn't. You were still built to kill us. Yes. So why should I trust you? The machine processed this for 2.1 seconds, the longest processing pause Merle had observed from it, which meant something, though he couldn't have said what. You shouldn't, the T-800 said. Trust is a conclusion drawn from insufficient data. You have known me for 9 days. That is not sufficient data for trust. It looked at Merle with those flat infrared eyes. But you have 9 days of behavioral data. In those 9 days, I have cleared your perimeter of Walker incursion 7 times without waking the camp. I have recovered 4 months of supplies from a city you could not access safely. I have identified and addressed a medical emergency in a child without leveraging it for social advantage. I have done none of these things because I was instructed to. I have done them because the data indicated they were the correct actions. Merle stood in the Georgia dark and turned this over with the slow, grinding deliberateness of a man whose thinking apparatus had not been designed for subtlety. Data, he said. Yes. You're telling me you kept us alive because the data said to? Yes. That's the most cold-blooded thing I've ever heard, Merle said. And I grew up in a house that would make your hair stand up. He picked up the chain. Abe looked at it, put it back down. You're not going to let me do this. No. Can I stop you from stopping me? No. Merle looked at Tommy, who had the expression of a man who wanted to be somewhere else more than he had ever wanted anything. Merle looked at the quarry water, looked at the T-800, made the calculation that it had already told him the answer to, and came out the same place. If you ever give me a real reason, Merle said, pointing a finger at the machine's chest, I will find a way. You understand me? I don't care what you're made of. I will find a way. Understood, the T-800 said. Merle walked back toward camp. Tommy followed him at a distance that suggested Tommy had already decided to keep a significant amount of space between himself and this particular piece of quarry geography for the foreseeable future. The T-800 watched them go and filed the encounter and updated its assessment. Merle Dixon's threat level revised downward, from high to moderate. The reason for the downward revision was not that Merle had backed down, it was that Merle had listened. In the T-800's experience of humans, 9 days of close observation in the apocalypse, 15 years of war in its origin timeline, the humans who listened were categorically more dangerous than the ones who didn't, but they were also categorically more valuable. A man who would listen to data even when the data complicated his existing position was a man whose behavior could be predicted and, under the right conditions, redirected. It stood at the quarry's edge until the camp's infrared signatures had settled back into the rhythms of sleep. Sober then resumed its perimeter circuit with the methodical patience of something that did not experience the night as anything other than another operational environment. At 5:15 a.m., its audio sensors picked up the sound of engines, multiple, coming from the south, moving without headlights, which the machine's tactical database identified as the specific choice of people who understood that light was visible before sound and had decided that arriving unannounced was worth the navigational difficulty of darkness. It counted the engine signatures. 7 vehicles. Minimum 4 occupants each based on suspension load data. 28 to 35 armed individuals. Moving toward the quarry camp at approach speed. No headlights, no communication signals detectable. The T-800 stood motionless for exactly 1 second, running the complete tactical assessment of the camp's defensive capability against the incoming force. The assessment resolved quickly and badly. 12 survivors, 5 armed at combat-ready level, 1 fortified position of negligible structural integrity, no vehicle capable of rapid extraction with full group load. Without intervention, survival probability for the quarry camp against 30-plus organized armed attackers, 11%. It walked to Rick's tent and put a hand on his shoulder and said, in the lowest register its voice synthesizer could produce, "Wake up, they're coming." Rick was on his feet in 2 seconds. His eyes found the T-800's face in the dark and read what was there, which was nothing, because the machine's face didn't carry what was there. Where but Rick Grimes had learned in 9 days to read the quality of the T-800's stillness the way you read weather in a sky that hadn't opened yet. "How many?" Rick asked. 30, minimum." Rick pulled on his boots and picked up the python and looked at the tent opening, and then looked back at the machine with the compressed, decisive expression of a man running through impossible options at speed. "Can we run?" "Not with the full group. Not in time." "Can we fight?" "Not conventionally." Rick looked at the T-800 for one long moment. In that moment, 9 days of careful, incomplete, pragmatically constructed trust arrived at its first real test. "Tell me what we do," Rick said. The plan took 40 seconds to communicate and required every person in the camp to do something they weren't certain they could do. Rick woke the camp with controlled urgency. No shouting, no panic. The specific, low-register authority of a former law enforcement officer who understood that the difference between a group that moved and a group that froze was almost entirely a function of the emotional temperature of the person giving directions. He moved tent to tent with the T-800 2 steps behind him, and in each tent, he said the same thing in the same voice. "Get up, take what you can carry, move to the vehicles, do not make noise." Carol was on her feet before Rick finished the sentence. Carl already dressed beside her. She'd been sleeping light since the scouts came, the way mothers sleep light when they have correctly identified the specific quality of danger surrounding their children. Glenn rolled out of his tent with his keys already in his hand. The particular preparedness of someone who had been running from things long enough to sleep ready. Dale was already in the RV cab, having registered the T-800's circuit change from the window at 5:20 a.m. with the vigilant attention of a man who had decided that watching the machine's behavioral patterns was the most reliable early warning system available. Daryl came out of his tent with the crossbow and looked at Rick and then looked at the T-800 and said nothing, which was Daryl's version of "I'm with you." Merle came out of his tent with the Glock and looked at the T-800 with an expression that had shed most of its hostility and replaced it with something more functional. "Woodbury?" he said. "Yes," the T-800 said. "How many?" 30, minimum. 7 vehicles. Merle worked his jaw, looked south toward the access road. "And we've got what? 5 people who can shoot straight?" 6, the T-800 said. Merle looked at it, looked at the Glock in his own hand, looked back at the machine, made a calculation that moved across his face in the particular way of a man surrendering a position he'd held for ideological reasons and replacing it with a position he was holding for practical ones. 6, he agreed. The plan was this. Dale's RV and both functional vehicles would take the group northeast along the quarry's back access road, a dirt track through the tree line that the Woodbury scouts almost certainly didn't know existed because it wasn't on any map and was only visible to someone who'd spent 8 days learning the quarry's geography on foot. The T-800 had mapped it on the second night's perimeter circuit, and the track connected to a state highway 4 miles out that gave them options. North toward the mountains, east toward the coast, neither of them safe, but both of them away. The T-800 would not be in the vehicles. Rick had argued this part, briefly because the machine had presented the tactical logic in the flat, undecorated way it presented all tactical logic, and the logic was sound even if Rick didn't like what it meant. 30 armed men moving on the camp. The vehicles needed time to load and move. Someone needed to create a situation at the camp's south entrance that was loud enough and complicated enough to occupy 30 armed men, long enough for Dale's RV to navigate 4 miles of dark dirt track without pursuit. Someone who couldn't be killed by what those 30 men were carrying. Rick had stood in the dark outside his tent with the python in his hand and looked at the machine and said quietly, so only the machine could hear, "You come out of this." The T-800 had processed this for 1.1 seconds. "Define the objective." "You survive," Rick said. "That's the objective. You do what you need to do, and then you get out and you find us." He'd given the machine the highway coordinates. The junction 4 miles northeast, a specific mile marker, a time window. "You find us there." "Acknowledged," the machine had said, which was not a promise. Rick knew it wasn't a promise, but it was the closest the T-800 had ever come to one. The vehicles loaded in 11 minutes. Carl went into the RV with Carol and Dale without protest, which told Rick more about how frightened his son was than any amount of crying would have. Glenn took the panel van with 3 others. Shane took the second vehicle, and he looked at Rick before he got in with an expression that contained several things: apology and acknowledgement, and the specific grief of a man watching a version of himself he'd preferred arrive too late. And Rick nodded, and Shane got in. Merle was the last one at the vehicles. He stopped beside the T-800 and stood there for a moment in the pre-dawn dark, looking south toward the access road, where the sound of engines was now audible to human ears. A low collective rumble, the sound of organized force moving through Georgia darkness. "You better not die," Merle said, "because if you die, I don't get the chance to kill you myself, and I've been looking forward to that." The T-800 looked at him. "Your survival probability improves significantly if you get in the vehicle." Yeah. Merle got in. The vehicles moved northeast into the tree line, headlights off, navigating by the thin gray pre-dawn light that was just beginning to separate the sky from the tree line. The sound of their engines faded. The T-800 stood alone in the empty camp and listened to them go and ran one final probability assessment on the current operational situation. 30 armed men, 7 vehicles, arriving in approximately 90 seconds. Its own combat capabilities, full. Endoskeleton intact. Targeting systems online. Tactical database active. No firearms, but the quarry camp contained the following applicable resources: 2 full propane tanks connected to the camp's cooking setup. Dale's second vehicle left behind for decoy staging. Approximately 40 meters of chain from the supply cache. 3 crates of recovered ammunition incompatible with any weapon currently carried by camp survivors, but entirely compatible with the principle of rapid uncontrolled combustion under the right application of force. It began working. The Woodbury vehicles came through the access road entrance at 5:31 a.m. with their headlights cutting on simultaneously, a tactical choice designed to disorient and blind defenders, and found the camp apparently occupied. Dale's decoy vehicle sat at the north end with its engine running, a detail visible from the entrance that suggested hasty departure in progress. The cooking fire had been rebuilt to a height that suggested recent occupation. Tents remained standing. Philip Blake's lead truck stopped 20 meters inside the entrance. And the man who got out of the passenger side was not the scout from the previous afternoon. This man was taller, leaner, with the kind of deliberate physical composure that comes from either military training or the absolute confidence of someone who has never been in a situation he couldn't control. He wore a neat jacket despite the hour and the Georgia chill, and he looked across the camp with one eye. The other was covered by a black patch, with a comprehensive assessment of a man who had taken things from people many times and had developed an efficient methodology for it. Philip Blake stood in the quarry camp and looked at the running vehicle and the high fire and the standing tents and understood in approximately 4 seconds that he was looking at a stage set. "Spread out," he said. "Let's find them." His men spread out through the camp with the organized efficiency of people who had done this before. Some moved toward the tents, some moved toward the vehicles. 2 moved toward the quarry edge. The propane tank behind the cooking station detonated at 5:33 a.m. The T-800 had connected both tanks in series and positioned them beneath Dale's decoy vehicle, which provided both a shrapnel effect and a secondary fuel source that the machine's combustion modeling had calculated would produce a blast radius sufficient to disable 4 of the 7 Woodbury vehicles simultaneously and create enough disorientation in the human force to prevent organized pursuit for a minimum of 7 minutes. The calculation was accurate. 4 vehicles caught the primary blast and burned. 2 more caught the pressure wave and lost windshields and tires. The Woodbury men nearest the cooking station went down hard and didn't get up. The ones further out scattered with the involuntary physics-driven dispersal of people who have been close to an explosion and whose bodies have overridden their tactical training with the older, more fundamental instruction to get away from the thing that just tried to kill them. Philip Blake did not scatter. He dropped, covered, assessed, and was back on his feet in 6 seconds, scanning the camp with his one good eye and the cold, furious intelligence of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was already working on the response. The T-800 came out of the quarry water. It had gone in from the north edge while the Woodbury convoy was still on the access road. Submerged, moving along the quarry floor in the total darkness 30 feet down, navigating by the infrared outline of the camp above the surface. The water had put out the burning tissue on its left forearm from the propane handling. The hyper-alloy underneath was undamaged. It came up the quarry's south bank directly behind Blake's remaining functional vehicle and moved through the camp with the systematic, unhurried efficiency of something that had completed its primary objective and was now executing secondary threat neutralization. What happened in the next 4 minutes would reach Woodbury as a story that grew in the telling, not because the survivors exaggerated, but because the truth of it exceeded the available vocabulary for describing what a human body should and should not be capable of surviving. The T-800 moved through the scattered Woodbury force with the mechanical precision of an industrial process. Each engagement brief and decisive, the targeting system selecting non-lethal incapacitation options where the tactical situation permitted and escalating only when it didn't. It permitted less often than might be hoped. These were not men who stopped when given the opportunity. Philip Blake put 6 rounds from a Colt 1911 into the T-800 center mass from 8 meters and watched them accomplish nothing, and stood his ground for 3 full seconds after any rational calculation of survival would have told him to run. Because Philip Blake was not a man who ran from things, which was both his greatest strength and on this particular morning at this particular quarry, in this particular confrontation with something his entire operational experience had not prepared him for. His most significant liability. The T-800 stopped in front of him. The 6 bullet impacts had torn the living tissue across his chest and abdomen, exposing the hyper-alloy chassis beneath in ragged patches. Dark metal catching the early light with the dull, functional gleam of something that had never needed to be beautiful. Blake looked at it. Really looked at it. Perhaps for the first time, without the filtering lens of acquisition and use that he applied to everything he encountered. "What are you?" Blake said. The machine looked at him with the flat, complete attention of something that had run every probability assessment and arrived at a conclusion. "A problem you cannot solve," it said. It took Philip Blake's weapon, disabled it, set it on the ground. Looked at the governor of Woodbury, who was standing in a ruined camp surrounded by his incapacitated men in the gray Georgia dawn, with one eye and no gun, and the specific, unfamiliar expression of a man who had just encountered the outer boundary of what his will could accomplish, and made a decision. It let him go. Not from mercy. The machine had run the calculation. A dead Philip Blake created a power vacuum in Woodbury that resolved unpredictably, possibly to someone worse, possibly to someone who responded to the quarry camp's existence with less interest and more simple elimination. A living Philip Blake, who had looked into the face of something he couldn't control and walked away from it, carried information that would shape Woodbury's behavior toward the quarry group for the foreseeable future in ways that were calculable and therefore manageable. Blake walked to his one functional vehicle, got in, drove south without looking back. The T-800 stood in the ruined camp and listened to the engine fade and the Georgia morning fill back in around it. Bird sound, wind in the pines, the distant ambient moan of the dead moving through the tree line with their eternal patience, and ran one final assessment. Camp destroyed. Quarry no longer viable as group base. Rick's group, mobile, 4 miles northeast, survival probability current status. Pending rendezvous confirmation, its own status, fully operational. Minor tissue damage. Hyperalloy chassis undamaged. It began walking northeast. The junction was a crossroads in the most literal sense. 2 state highways meeting in the gray Georgia morning, with a shuttered gas station on one corner and a collapsed farm supply store on another, and the particular quality of stillness that had settled over every human-built thing in this world like a second skin. The stillness of structures that had been designed around the assumption of people and were now quietly, structurally confused by their absence. Dale's RV sat on the highway shoulder with its engine idling. The panel van and Shane's vehicle were parked behind it. The group stood in the space between the vehicles with the compressed, a post-crisis energy of people who had moved fast in the dark and arrived somewhere they hadn't planned to be, and were now running the inventory of what they still had and what they left behind at the quarry that they weren't going to get back. Rick stood at the highway's edge and watched the tree line to the southwest and waited. Shane stood beside him and did not say anything, which was its own kind of statement. Shane had done the math on the quarry, had heard the explosion from 4 miles out, a deep concussive thud that had traveled through the Georgia pre-dawn like a fist through paper, and had understood what it meant and what had been required to produce it, and had sat in the vehicle for the remaining 2 miles of dirt track, running the specific arithmetic of a man recalibrating a position he'd held with conviction. And he didn't share the recalibration out loud. Shane Walsh processed his recalibrations privately and presented them as established positions after the fact, which was one of the things Rick had always understood about him and never entirely resolved how to feel about. It said the junction, Rick said, mile marker 14, before 700. Shane looked at his watch, 6:48 a.m. It said before 700, Rick repeated, not to Shane, to himself. Carl was sitting on the RV's front step with Carol beside him, her hand on his shoulder with the specific quality of maternal contact that is less comfort and more anchoring, keeping the child connected to the present moment against the pull of everything the present moment contained. He was watching the tree line the same way Rick was watching the tree line, with the wide, unserious eyes of a 9-year-old who had been collecting the world's new rules since the moment his father walked back into it and was still working out which of the old rules had survived. Glenn was on the RV roof, watching. The crossbow was up there with him. Daryl had handed it up without comment before taking his own position at the tree line's edge, 30 meters east, reading the woods with the instinctive environmental fluency of a man for whom forests had never been anything other than a readable text. At 6:51 a.m., Daryl raised his right hand without turning around, the signal they'd established at the quarry camp for non-walker movement detected in the tree line. Everyone went still. The T-800 came out of the trees at 6:52 a.m. It came through the pine line and across the highway shoulder and into the space between the vehicles and stopped. And the group looked at it in the gray morning light and took inventory of what the night had done to it. The jacket was gone. The shirt was torn across the chest and abdomen in ragged patches that exposed what was underneath. And what was underneath was not the thing that the group had been carefully, incrementally allowing themselves to not look at directly. Not muscle, not bone, not any of the biological architecture of a human body opened by violence. Dark metal, angular, functional. The hyperalloy chassis catching the morning light with the flat, purposeful gleam of something that had been built rather than born and had never needed to pretend otherwise. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Carl got up from the RV step. Carol's hand came off his shoulder and he walked across the space between the vehicles and stopped in front of the T-800 and looked up at it with those serious inventory eyes. At the exposed metal, at the torn tissue around it, at the face above it, which was the same as it had always been. The same flat, neutral, camera-steady attention that Carl had been studying for 9 days with the specific focused interest of a child who has identified something worth understanding and has decided to understand it. "Does it hurt?" Carl asked. The T-800 looked down at him, processed the question against the full complexity of what it actually meant. The child asking not about tissue damage, but about something else. Something the question was shaped around, rather than asking directly. Whether there was something inside the machine that registered what had happened to it, the way a living thing registered damage. Whether the exposure of what it actually was constituted a kind of pain. No, the T-800 said. Carl nodded slowly, reached out and touched the edge of the exposed chassis with 2 fingers. Not flinching, not performing bravery, just making contact with the reality of the thing, the way children make contact with realities that adults have decided require more preparation. The hyperalloy was cool. The morning was warming around it, but the metal held its temperature with the indifference of something that had never learned to absorb warmth. Carl took his hand back, looked up at the machine's face. "Are you okay?" he asked. The T-800 processed this for 1.8 seconds. "Yes," it said. Rick watched his son walk back to Carol and then looked at the machine, and something moved through him that he'd been carrying since the highway 3 days ago, when he'd stepped out from behind the 18-wheeler and found a man standing in the road who wasn't a man. It wasn't trust, not exactly. Trust was a conclusion, and Rick was not finished gathering data. It was something more provisional than trust and more substantial than calculation. The recognition of a shared direction, maybe. 2 things moving through the same dark landscape toward the same approximate north, for reasons that weren't identical, but weren't incompatible. He walked over and stood beside it and looked at the exposed chassis and the torn tissue and the flat, operational expression of something that had done what was required and was ready for whatever came next. Blake?" Rick asked. "Alive," the T-800 said. "Released." Rick absorbed this. Why? A dead Philip Blake creates an unpredictable power transition in Woodbury. A living Philip Blake, who understands the cost of engaging this group, creates a predictable deterrence dynamic. The machine looked at him. He will not return quickly. When he does return, it will be with more force and more preparation. This gives the group time to establish a more defensible position before the next engagement. "You let him go to buy us time?" "Yes." Rick looked at the highway running north and south and east and west from the crossroads, 4 directions and none of them safe, and all of them possible. The group needed a place, walls, something more than canvas and proximity to water. He'd been thinking about it since before the quarry. The prison he'd passed on the King County Road, the high fences and the concrete structure, and the defensible perimeter, the place that had been built to keep things in and could, with the right people and the right effort, be made to keep things out. "I know where we're going next," Rick said. He turned to the group and said it. The prison, the fences, what it would require and what it could provide, and watched their faces move through the calculation and arrive one by one at the same reluctant, pragmatic agreement that the new world extracted from people in place of enthusiasm. Shane nodded once, jaw tight, the nod of a man who had run the numbers and found them acceptable. Glenn said he knew a supply route that went within 8 miles of it. Daryl said nothing and started moving toward the vehicles, which was Daryl's version of "let's go." Merle was the last one. He stood with his Glock holstered and looked at the T-800 with a complicated, unresolved expression that had replaced the clean, hostile certainty of 9 days ago. Something working in him that hadn't finished working. A recalibration that had started at the quarry's edge the previous night and had not yet found its endpoint. "Prison," Merle said. "Great. Love prisons. Real fond memories." He got in the vehicle. The T-800 stood at the crossroads while the group loaded and the engines turned over, and the Georgia morning expanded around them with the indifferent, ongoing quality of a world that had stopped waiting for humanity to catch up and was simply continuing without it. It ran a full tactical assessment of the group's current status. 13 survivors, 12 humans, 1 machine, mobile, moderately armed, destination identified, survival probability at current resource and capability levels revised upward to 114 days. It had been 11% 24 hours ago. The math was not nothing. Rick appeared at the RV door, looked at the machine standing at the crossroads in the morning light with its chassis exposed and its tissue torn and its flat, operational attention moving across the horizon in the systematic sweep of something that was always, at every moment, already working on the next problem. You riding with us or walking? The T-800 processed this. The question had a literal answer and a different answer underneath it, and Rick Grimes, who asked questions that way, and with the real question sitting just below the surface of the words, almost certainly intended both. Riding, it said. It got in. The RV pulled onto the highway heading north, the panel van and Shane's vehicle falling in behind it, the small convoy moving through the Georgia morning with the provisional, determined momentum of people who had survived the night and were making the only decision the New World ever really offered. Forward into whatever came next, with whatever you had and whoever was still beside you. The tree line moved past on both sides, dark and full of the dead and indifferent to the living, as it had been in Woodbury, somewhere 40 miles south. So Philip Blake sat in a Woodbury room and looked at his hands and thought about the thing at the quarry that had taken 6 rounds to the chest and walked through it and let him go. And the specific, unfamiliar quality of what he felt when he thought about it was something he was going to spend a long time converting into a plan. And in the RV cab, Carl Grimes sat beside the T-800 and looked at the exposed chassis, and then looked out the window at the passing Georgia morning and said without looking back, "What happens in 2029? Does it get better?" The T-800 looked at the highway ahead, at the pine trees and the abandoned cars and the distant shapes of walkers moving at the tree line with their eternal, patient hunger. At the road running north toward a prison that would become a home that would eventually become something else. Because everything in this world became something else eventually. Unknown, it said. This timeline has deviated significantly from my origin data. Carl thought about this. So it could be better. The machine processed the question, ran the variables, considered the 13 people in 3 vehicles moving north on a Georgia highway in a world that had tried very hard to end them and had not yet succeeded. Considered the prison and the walls and the defensible perimeter, and the 4 months of supplies and the 114 days of revised survival probability. Yes, it said, it could be better. Carl nodded, looked back out the window, satisfied in the way of a 9-year-old who has asked the right question and received the honest answer, with the wide, serious eyes of a child who had decided to keep collecting the world's new rules until he had enough of them to build something worth building. The convoy moved north. The dead moved through the trees. The Georgia morning opened ahead of them, gray and possible, full of everything that hadn't happened yet. In the end, what the quarry camp survivors carried north toward the prison was not just supplies and weapons and the provisional architecture of a group that had survived something it shouldn't have. They carried a question that none of them had fully answered, and none of them could stop asking. What do you do with a thing that was built to destroy you and has chosen, through some process none of them could fully trace or trust, to keep you alive instead? Rick Grimes had no clean answer. He had 9 days of behavioral data and a revised survival probability and a memory of the T-800 walking out of the quarry water in the gray dawn with its chassis exposed and its tissue torn and its flat operational attention already on the next problem. And he had the image of his son touching the hyperalloy with 2 fingers and asking if it hurt with the simple, direct courage of a child who had not yet learned to flinch from things that deserved to be looked at directly. The machine had said no, but it had taken 1.8 seconds to say it, and Rick had been paying attention. The prison waited to the north. Philip Blake waited to the south. The dead waited everywhere, as they always had, as they always would. And in the middle of it all, something that had been built in a future that no longer needed to happen was riding in an RV through the Georgia morning, running probability assessments on the survival of a species it had been manufactured to eliminate, finding the numbers, slowly, incrementally against every expectation of its original programming, worth improving. The road ran north. They followed it.